the third installment of our series of webinars on Africa's digital platform ecosystem. For those who may not be aware of Insight to Impact and its work, it's a 5-year program that was jointly founded by Senfree and Finmark Trust exactly 5 years ago, and is also partly funded by both the MasterCard Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So a few years ago, our work really started to shift, and our focus then became on the core technological actors that use data to reduce information asymmetries and enable greater efficiencies within emerging digital economies in Africa. Now, one specific technological actor which has been sort of taking a shaping role in this has been digital platforms. Now, in our view, these are the real pivotal actors which have been matching supply and demand for goods and services for some time now. And in 2018, we actually estimated that approximately 216,000 micro workers across 7 African countries were being matched to e-hailing job opportunities through platform ecosystems. And this was based on a survey conducted by Research ICT Africa. To date, however, data on this ecosystem still remains fairly limited, but we at i2i have taken the first steps in doing a series of systematic reviews of the landscape of digital platforms across 8 focus countries. And today we'll be speaking to some of the insights that have been emerging from the data that we've tracked across hundreds of platforms within the region's platform economy. So in our previous webinars, we discussed the early impact of COVID-19 on activity within the platform ecosystem and on the platform outlook for platform workers as a result of this. We then looked at how digital financial services add value to platform users and how they actually use to build resilience during the COVID-19 pandemic. But in today's segment, we'll be placing one specific type of platform, namely e-hailing, under the microscope in order to better understand how this dynamic industry has been developing in Africa and how it's actually impacting the livelihoods of individual workers, or drivers in this case, who participate on these platforms. Now, given the current crisis, we'll also be exploring how these platforms have responded to the various lockdown measures adopted in a number of jurisdictions and what this has meant for drivers, as well as how it's impacted the longer-term strategies of major platform operators. So on that note, we can move to the next slide, and I'll introduce the speaker lineup for today's webinar. So myself, I'm Matthew Dunn. I'm a senior researcher at Senfree and Insight to Impact. In my role at Senfree, I've primarily worked in the digital platform economy and around the development of inclusive insurance solutions within our risk team. Before that, I worked in the monitoring and evaluation practice at Genesis Analytics. Alongside me, I have my colleague, Peter Jansen van Vieren. Peter's a senior researcher at Senfree as well and works primarily as part of our risk team. Now, his work focuses on the role of insurance in supporting economic growth, including updating Senfree's database of insurtechs in emerging markets. He was also an integral part of the team that explored the digital platforms in Africa and their role in supporting economic development and financial inclusion. Prior to joining Senfree, Peter also worked as an economic analyst at Green Cape. And now on to our panelists. Our first panelist today that I'll be introducing is Raymond Aloha. So Raymond's a research fellow at the Lagos Business School in Nigeria, where his research focuses on the institutional and policy challenges in the internet economy and technology innovation in developing countries, with a special focus on sub-Saharan Africa. He's also a research consultant with Research ICT Africa, which I mentioned a bit earlier, where his focus lies primarily in digital governance, policy and regulation of digital technologies for social and economic development in Africa. Next, we have Julie Zalman. So Julie's a researcher and consultant who's been studying how ordinary people use technology and finance to navigate their economic lives. And for the past year, she's been leading an in-depth study on the impact of job matching platforms on the labor market in Nairobi in Kenya. And this has included a 6-week panel of 450 e-hailing drivers' incomes and expenses. Now, Julie also led the Kenya Financial Diary study and is the author of a forthcoming book titled Living on Little, which is out in July this month. And then Julie's currently completing a PhD at the Fletcher School with a focus on development economics and African studies. Our final panelist is Gareth Tyler. So Gareth is a country manager at Bolt, South Africa. But before joining Bolt, he had a 5-year career at the Aware2 project, which is one of South Africa's leading incubators and investment funds, where he held numerous management positions, including head of business incubation and post-investment management, and then later acted as the chief operating officer in 2017. So as you can see, we have quite a diverse group of experts on our panel today, and I look forward to hearing their views on this interesting topic. So thank you all for your time. But before we dive into the discussion, I'd like to just introduce a few process updates for the webinar. So for this webinar, we've decided to disable the chat function, but if you have a look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see we will be running a Q&A function throughout the webinar. And here you'll be able to submit questions as well as vote up questions from other participants. And at the end of the panel discussion, we'll select out a couple of these questions that you put forward, which we'll pose to our speakers, and they can meaningfully answer some of the burning issues that you as the audience may have in mind. Great, so I think I've taken up enough time. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Peter, who will take us through some of Sendfree and i2i's research on e-hailing platforms in Africa. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Matt, for that very kind introduction. So as Matt mentioned, we conducted a systemic review of digital platforms across 8 countries in Africa. So these are multi-sided platforms, matching demand and supply, and facilitating transactions on their platforms. One of these categories was e-hailing. And just to clarify, just in case it's not clear, e-hailing platforms are multi-sided platforms matching for on-demand transport solutions. So over the past few years, the e-hailing market has seen robust growth. 81 e-hailing platforms operating in 2019, up from 53 in 2018. We can see on the map here that the top 3 markets in operation are Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. And from Statistica, we have some estimates of the revenue and a user base showing that it's actually a really significant market, almost $2.5 billion worth of revenue and nearly 50 million users across Africa. We think that the growth of this emerging industry has been underpinned by urbanization, coupled with increases in digital access, primarily through mobile phones. This has resulted in expanded consumer appetite for on-demand transportation services, as well as low barriers of entry for drivers. Moreover, we've also seen many homegrown platforms that take advantage of local knowledge to compete with some of the industry giants, such as Uber and Bolt. We've observed significant churn in the market, with many of these new entrants also leaving the market over a short period of time. So the average age of the e-hailing platforms we've actually found in our scan is only 1.8 years. In Nigeria, we've also seen the growth supported by venture capital funding, for example, with Kukada and MaxNG, both raising more than $5 million worth of funding. To get a sense of the kind of scale we've seen, we've also looked at some domain traffic from SEMrush. Looking at monthly users for the different platforms, you can see that the top 3 platforms we find have more than 1 million users, if you assume that there's no multi-homing. But at the same time, we've also found that the average user base for the platforms that we found was only 18,000. So there's a significant tail of smaller platforms within the region. So, as I mentioned, the 3 largest e-hailing markets are Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. We thought it'd be worth just providing some context to the operating environments of these countries as context for our panel discussion. Firstly, I guess it's important to note that even in these lead markets, the penetration of e-hailing isn't that significant, because a significant share of African populations are still living in rural areas that, while the e-hailing platforms only operate in the urban centers. The other important thing here to note is just the high share of the informal sector within these economies, particularly in Nigeria, where most people actually seem to earn have more than one source of income. And unemployment is specifically significant in South Africa. But these contextual factors, coupled with low barriers for drivers of entry into the e-hailing, simply a roadworthy vehicle, a driver's license, and a clear criminal record, provide a key opportunity in these countries for many informal labor market participants. That being said, in developed markets, many e-hailing drivers don't own the vehicles. The survey of 138 e-hailing drivers in Nigeria, for example, revealed that 50% of e-hailing drivers didn't own the vehicle. And we found similar results during customer research in Rwanda for car drivers, were slightly higher for motorbikes. Next, I'll provide some color on the livelihoods of the e-hailing drivers in these countries. One of the key questions we investigated, of course, is the earning potential for drivers. So relative to the monthly minimum wages stipulated in the country, the data we've saw suggests that e-hailing drivers earn well above minimum wage levels on a monthly basis. But these data do hide a lot to some extent. For example, if we look, the first obvious one is, of course, that platform deductions also need to be taken into consideration. And we see on average, it's about 20% within the region, actually prompting some already regulatory responses in Kenya to cap these at 15%. Outside of platform deductions, drivers also face high running costs. The example in South Africa illustrates this quite well, where a seemingly significant amount of income actually reduces really significantly after you account for operating costs, including fuel and mobile data. And I believe Julie will also be providing some more detail of this within the Kenyan context. I mean, after the employment earnings, the other important consideration is the number of hours worked. Many drivers work long hours in the industry to make a meaningful monthly wage. In Nigeria, for example, our surveyed drivers reported working on average 8 hours a day, but nearly a third of the drivers reported working 12 or more hours in a day. We've seen some shift to address these limits on the hours worked being introduced by platforms, which leads me to some of the regulatory environment that we've seen emerging in the space. Firstly, we've seen a push towards more regulatory in the space across the board, with draft regulations in each of these countries. Kenya, we have the National Transport Authority, that has draft regulations on its website. Nigeria has draft legislation, but only for the Lagos state. And South Africa has a National Land Transportation Amendment Bill that's just awaiting final sign-off. But part of the issues that have bounded within the regulatory is highlighted within the recent Competition Commission report within South Africa that actually found that 79% of operators lacked valid operating licenses. Another key consideration for the regulators has been ensuring that platforms pay their fair share of taxes. In Kenya, the draft regulations require e-hailing platforms to be incorporated locally and have tax clearance certificates. Well, in contrast, Lagos state has proposed a 10% tax. If you consider the 10% tax in addition to the platform deductions, this is nearly a third of earnings that platform drivers are earning that they aren't receiving, which is likely to impact the livelihood significantly. South Africa has also tightened up its value-added tax regulations, including marketplaces like e-hailing platforms as suppliers, so they will have to pay tax, though transportation is still VAT-free, so as you won't see a VAT line on your bill when you actually use the platforms. The other big trend around the regulations has been the status of workers on these platforms, and whether they're allowed any of the protection that employees have, or whether they remain as contractors. This has actually been well laid out within the Competition Report in South Africa. where they highlight that the employee-employer relations do not apply to an independent contract, as with e-hailing platforms, and that where there's no formal contract. But they do highlight that the labor regulations were made when the idea of e-hailing platform wasn't even considered. They go further to say that the effect is that e-hailing platforms can interpret the rules of engagement with the operators, who offer in a weaker bargaining position and have no pension, sick leave, or decent work conditions. This has actually been, and we've seen some emerging representations of workers trying to represent the drivers on these platforms as well, both in Nigeria and South Africa listed here. But this has been such a highly debated issue. We actually thought it'd be interesting to see what you as our audience think about this. So I'm going to just launch the poll now, and we're really interested to hear, what do you think of the role of the classification of e-hailing drivers? Should it be structured given the work that they're doing? Do you think that platforms are simply this marketplace with the technology connecting drivers, and all the drivers are micro entrepreneurs? Or do we actually think that platforms do more than simply provide the marketplace, and should we have some role to play as for employees? Or actually it's a completely clear worker relationship that should definitely be providing formal benefits? Or are you boring and have a fence setting with no specific view? I suggest that for the sake of discussion, even if you have a weakly held view, that we'd rather have one of the other answers. So I see we've gotten about half of the attendees responded. Give it another few seconds. I don't want to give it away. I can see the responses, but I don't want to give it away to sway those that haven't voted yet. I'll give it another 10 seconds to vote, so we get, ensure we give everyone a chance to consider this issue. Okay, and every time I want to stop, I see another vote come in. I think we're gonna get, that's as high as we're probably gonna get. So I'm just gonna end the polling now. I'm gonna share the results. As we can see, we do have a few fence sitters, but actually the majority say that there is some role as an employee, but it's not clear that drivers should be considered full-time employees. I think that's the position that most people take. Because the relationship isn't that strictly of a worker employee. And it's also really interesting, but that being said, there is a lot of control that some of these platforms do have over the work that's being done, over the prices that are being set during the work. So it's not strictly a marketplace either, because there's a lot of control by the platforms as well. And then for my last bit of context, before we launch into the panel discussion, I just wanted to highlight some of the responses we've seen from the e-hailing platforms in response to COVID-19. So firstly, the lockdown restrictions have a clear limitation on the e-hailing drivers' ability to earn income during this time, with restricted hours of operations and restrictions on travel in general. And across the globe, we've also seen e-hailing platforms responding with health and sanitation measures and providing education and resources to limit the risk of infection. I think one of the key things here is drawing on the ability of platforms to share information very quickly and very easily. We've also seen some platforms extend further rights to the drivers, as they were previously accustomed to. For example, Uber has provided sick pay. We've also seen special relief funds for platform workers, including Gojek in Southeast Asia. And we've also seen some insurance offerings, such as Grab and Chubb, that provide delivery workers with COVID-19 insurance benefits. Our tracking of developments in the sector also revealed that e-hailing has been pivoting to other sectors, such as logistics and courier, as consumer demand for online shopping and delivery services increased. With that, I'd like to hand back to Matt. To start our panel discussion, we delve into the driver experiences and pivoting strategies of e-hailings in more depth with our panel.
Great, thanks so much, Peter. And I think that's given us a really good contextual basis for the next set of discussions with our experts. And at this point, if we can move to the next slide. So you'll see on the next slide, oh, here it is. So we cover a number of themes in our panel discussion. And I've just highlighted some of the leading questions for you to see in this slide. But to get all the panelists a bit more active and rotating in this virtual room, I'd like to just ask all of them that are able to join us by video to do so now, so that we can move into gallery view. And then we can pretty much dive into the discussion. Great. So hi Raymond, hi Julie, hi Gareth, welcome to you all. So as we go into the expert panel discussion, we'll be exploring some really topical issues. And I think that out of all our panelists, we've actually worked most extensively with Lagos Business School to try and grasp the developments within the platform economy in the region. And so my first question will actually be directed at you, Raymond. So Nigeria, I think, makes for a very interesting and unique case study when we talk about e-hailing. Because on one hand, you have this massive market and a transport sector that appears to be crying out for innovative solutions to ease the structural challenges facing commuters. And I think that's particularly the case in Lagos. But then on the other hand, we see that we have quite a bit of regulatory uncertainty that appears to be hampering e-hailing platforms and drivers alike. So I wonder if you could speak to us about some of the key developments in this market leading up to and during the COVID crisis. So basically just to give us a kind of a feel for the state of e-hailing in Nigeria and the impact that it's had on the lives of workers.
Thank you, Matt, and good day to all the panelists and the participants on this webinar. I hope I'm audible enough. Matt?
Yes.
Yeah, so before I go on to answer your question with respect to the e-hailing market and the developments within this sector in Nigeria, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic, I would like to first of all give a contextual background of the sector pre-COVID with respect to some key regulatory developments in the sector, as this has a compounding effect on the current situation. So even before the pandemic was in full swing around February this year, the Lagos state government had banned the bike hailing platforms from operating across some of the major areas in the state, with reasons given such as rising accident rates, although this particular position was countered by the mobility platforms, with several of them showing data that their accident rates were quite lower, at an average less than 0.05% of the total accidents in the state. And their position was also in congruence with the data that was released by the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics. But aside from the accident rates, there were other issues that were raised by the Lagos state government, including increasing crime rates, as to say that these platforms, especially the motorbikes, were often used as getaway means by criminals operating within the state. And in a much more longer term perspective, the Lagos state government did not consider the motorbikes in any form, whether they were platformized or not, as part of the furniture with regards to the Lagos State Urban Transportation Master Plan. So the state had proposed in its long-term view, integrating modern bus rapid transits, known as BRTs, with modern rail line corridors. So with these points from the government, they stood their ground, they stood to their guns, and these bike-hailing platforms were put out of business with the ban in the key commercial areas that constituted about 70 to 80% of their revenues. The impact of this ban was that, one, and very apparent, a loss of livelihood for a majority of mobility platform workers in Lagos, especially those who are operating the bikes on these platforms. And then in a much broader sense, the ban sort of discouraged the potential growth of these platform businesses by impeding further investments, as these startups had attracted significant amounts of foreign investment, and they had scaled up ambitions, plans for the near and long term. So this ban with respect to investments, it opened up the possibility for some of these investors to begin to look at moving their capital to more favorable markets with less hostile business environments, even as they sat back, counted their losses, and watched how events unfolded within the Nigerian space. And even on the horizontal, even for similar startups in Nigeria that they are hoping to, get more funding from investors, the ban situation became a major setback with respect to attracting investments for their business. So since then, with the ban situation, there have been ongoing engagements between these platforms and the government, with several propositions being thrown around before they can be allowed back to operate as normal, such as having hackney permits that will have to be issued by the state motor vehicle admin agency. And also there were proposed regulations that will require even not just the bike services, but also the car service platforms to pay license fees of about $60,000 and about $25,000 renewal, or $12,000 in a case where they have less than 1,000 drivers on their platform. And so the state government also proposed in the new regime for the operation that they will have to now collect a 10% commission on every single trip that these platforms complete. So these are quite stringent measures, although the platforms have continued negotiations with the government with respect to these operational guidelines. But as of today, nothing is yet concretized. So if you move this forward into the pandemic situation, just a month after the ban was in place with the pandemic crisis, the Nigerian president having imposed the lockdown on March 29 in key cities that included Lagos and Abuja in a bid to contain the spread of the virus. This led directly to some of these ride-hailing platforms, to the ride-hailing platforms suspending their operations in the country, with most of them pivoting their businesses to logistics and deliveries of essential commodities. This situation at least provided some form of leeway for a number of their drivers to continue generating some revenue even during the lockdown. This situation continued and subsisted till a month later with the gradual easing of the lockdown. The platforms have since then resumed operations in Lagos and Abuja, although in a significantly constrained model, because even with the phase 2 guidelines that were recently released for easing the lockdown in Nigeria, there is still a general curfew in place now from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. So they cannot operate beyond those timelines. And some of those critical timelines are, in normal circumstances, the period where they make their highest revenue in terms of demand and traffic on the platforms. And also, considering the pandemic situation, because of the physical distancing guidelines, because there's a limit on the number of passengers that can be on a single trip. For example, Nova X that normally we take 4 people can now only take maximum 3. And while cars that previously could take 3 now can only take 2. So these constraints have a direct impact on the livelihoods of the e-hailing drivers that are domiciled within these platforms. And it cuts across because based on our survey, they actually multi-home across most of these platforms that they are working, but the situation is basically the same with minor differences here and there. So the key impacts that the pandemic constraints is having on them is that, number one, due to the place-based nature of the micro work that they provide, they are at a significantly higher risk of being infected by the virus because of close proximity to riders, even with the measures that have been put in place by these platforms. And in the event that they get sick, they just won't be able to keep working. And so that vicious cycle continues. And also for those drivers that are still able to work, while it is not clear how it is not clear yet how the reduction in capacity will affect the base pricing by these platforms. We know that the level of demand, one, the distances covered, as well as the capacity utilization these three form critical factors in the total pricing for these platforms. And this will definitely have a significant negative impact on the earnings of these drivers, considering that they are working on reduced hours due to the imposed curfew, and also that even the curfew, not just directly to them, but the directives also stipulate that even companies and manufacturing firms can only allow about 60% of their staff force to return to work, also with reduced work hours, only from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And this, of course, has an impact on the demand of their services. So putting all these issues together, it gives you a snapshot of the e-hailing operational landscape in the country during this trying time. So I'll stop here and maybe interject more as the conversation goes on. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for that, Raymond. So I think for me, it seems like what was already quite a difficult situation or regulatory environments, operating environments in Lagos due to the regulation was only further exacerbated by kind of the onset of COVID-19 crisis. And it'll be interesting to actually see how the market develops in Nigeria in the coming months, and how workers are actually able to protect themselves during these times. But I think just building on Raymond's insights, Julie, I'd actually like to shift the discussion slightly to the Kenyan market and for us to drill down a bit deeper into the topic of driver experiences. And maybe you could talk us through some of the findings from the work that you've been doing to help us understand how factors like income and costs actually stack up for these drivers to affect their livelihoods on these platforms.
Thanks, Matt. So what we've been doing here is to try to really get a handle on what are the actual income and expenses from a neutral perspective. We hear a lot of driver protests about wages being too low. We hear the platforms giving another story. And yet we have very little hard data about how much people are earning. So starting in mid-September, we ran a 6-week panel with 530 drivers starting and 450 finishing, looking across platforms to look at income and expenses across both platforms, or all platforms that they're using. And we were able to verify the income data from screenshots for weekly summaries across platforms. So that data is really good. Where there's some iffy things are around expenses. And unfortunately, that's where we get a lot of iffy information as well from the platforms. So what we've been doing is to look at those expenses in a huge range of ways. And actually the lowest estimate that we can get after looking at AA rates and things like that, so that's the Automobile Association operational costs, was that the lowest rate we could calculate for the lowest amount of expenditure, so the highest possible profitability, was actually what drivers themselves reported. And when we look at that, we see that under no circumstances are really any of the drivers meeting hourly minimums that are set by the Kenyan government. So that's around $2.60. And when I say hourly minimums, we're talking about like what would be a wage. So after commissions, but also after fuel and bundles, which were huge expenses for the drivers. But the drivers are able to work long hours, and some get close to monthly minimums. And the monthly minimum in Nairobi for a driver is actually substantially higher than you all have as an estimate. It's around $200 and something. About a quarter of drivers can get to the monthly minimum by working long hours. But there's a huge problem of fixed costs there, and that if they're paying for an asset, whether it's through a partner or through a bank loan, they work much longer hours to meet that fixed cost. So once we account for the cash flows that are being removed from that asset, we see that drivers are making only about $100 a month. So that's like their take-home wage, unless they own their car already, and then it's about double that. So this is really quite concerning, and that, if their total revenue after commissions is around $800, that was about the average for us, they're only taking home about 100 of that. So those are huge differences. At the same time, even though drivers are complaining about their wages, they really like the work. And they like the work not because it's flexible, because honestly, if you have to work 65 hours a week, that's not very flexible, right? You can't very easily take a day off without that hurting quite a lot. So they said, actually, flexible, not really, but I really like to be my own boss. I meet interesting people, I get exposure. I don't have anyone breathing down my neck. And with some platforms, they make life fairly stress-free, and that when there are problems with customers, it's the platform who sorts them out. So in terms of a business, they really like it. And I think that that's one of the reasons that drivers are fighting so hard to have a wage that they find more livable. I think the challenge is that making these fixed cost investments in a space where the platform controls the price, the platform controls the supply, and those terms are constantly changing. So those are some of the big issues that we're seeing coming out. And those are just rough estimates. You know, we're trying to really make sure that we have 100% confidence in all of our numbers before we publish our final estimations.
Very cool. So, I mean, it sounds to me like, as you say, while drivers do report that they enjoy, to an extent, working on platforms, there's definitely this underlying financial strain that many of them are having to deal with that I think a lot of us may not actually be aware of. So the scale of these costs. And I think you actually touched on this just now, Julie, but maybe you could go into a bit more detail about the extent to which these contracts offered by platforms may actually be exacerbating this income cost dynamic that workers face.
Right. So right now we have, so from our data, about half of drivers rent a car from an owner, about 30% have a bank loan, and about 20% own their cars outright. So in that case, you know, we work in low capital markets, and this may be less the case in South Africa, but certainly in Nigeria and Kenya, to own a car is quite an expensive proposition and not something that is available to a lot of people. So in order to make that investment, they're banking on a certain level of cash flows. The challenge is that the platform is maximizing its own revenues, and there are some incentives for them to increase driver volumes and to adjust prices to maximize the market size. And the platforms are not locked in Kenya to sticking with a certain price structure and a certain guarantee of sort of like the supply that they're going to keep for any period of time. So really, drivers and car owners are taking a huge risk. They bear all of the risks in this scenario, right? They bear the risk that the platforms change the prices. They bear the risk of changing fuel costs. They bear the risks of changing supply. They bear all of it. And when that's, you know, a low-income driver, that's probably not the right place for all of the risks to sit. So I think that there's some possibilities of introducing very market-friendly regulation that just regulates the duration of the fixed contract around the commission structures that supply negotiations between the driver partners and the platforms themselves.
Great, thanks, Julie. That's really interesting. I'll shift to Gareth now as our industry player. I think. So Gareth, I think e-hailing platforms have, in particular, have been seen as a model for other platforms during the crisis. So for the way in which they've actually rapidly responded to the numerous complexities that have been brought about by the crisis and various lockdown measures. Given your industry experience, can you maybe speak to us about how platforms such as Bolt are actively responding to the crisis and what this has actually meant for driver livelihoods and for e-hailing going forward, particularly given in South Africa's case, the recent easing of lockdown measures?
Oh, thank you, Matthew. So, yeah, I mean, we introduced a number of measures since the lockdown started to try and maximize the transactions on the platform and to maximize driver earnings as well. The first that we did was to introduce the isolated category. So this is basically installing a plastic screen between the driver and the passenger, so that limiting the flow of air between the driver and passenger. And we then, as a result, have launched a new category called Bolt Isolated in South Africa. So we've been installing this at Bolt's cost into the drivers' vehicles, and the drivers that have this and are on the isolated category are earning up to 50% more during this time. So that was one of the initiatives that we took just to safeguard the drivers more, as well as to make passengers feel more comfortable. The reason that there are higher earnings there is because the individuals who are taking trips on this category are taking longer trips, and there's more demand, so we're seeing higher number of trips per hour. So that was one of the initiatives. The other one is we launched Bolt Business Delivery, which is basically enabling individuals with e-commerce capability. So they have an online platform already, and they are then, maybe they need a little bit of assistance just in capacity for last mile delivery. So they're able to sign up, and then for 30 Rand, they can get their goods delivered within 8 kilometers. That was the next one. We also launched Bolt Food in Cape Town. And during level 5, that we could only deliver groceries, pet food, supplements, etc. Now that we're in level 3 and in level 4 as well, we're able to deliver from restaurants. So we did that. And then we also launched a couple of other categories. We launched vans, which is 8 to 12 seaters in Gauteng. We launched a partnership with the Tuck Fleet to be able to ensure that they could carry on operating. And then also obviously we still have the lowest commission in South Africa. Another thing that we also did for the drivers was we're issuing free sanitization liquid refills at all of our driver centers on a daily basis for the drivers to come and get that. That is a regulatory requirement that they have sanitization liquid refills. So those are a couple of the things that we've been doing during the lockdown, just to try and assist drivers and passengers just to be as safe as possible. And to maximize earnings and reduce costs.
Cool. So I mean, those are really interesting and a lot of really practical solutions. I think that a lot of other e-hailing platforms could implement in their business. I'm just wondering, from I guess an organizational priority perspective, how has this crisis, if so, has it shifted what Bolt is prioritizing in terms of its operations going forward? And maybe can you speak to us about that a bit?
Yeah, so I think this is a really exciting sector to be in. We're going through a revolution that we haven't seen in 100 years. You know, the last big revolution was going from horse-drawn carriages to motorized vehicles, where now there's the advent of electric vehicles. There is autonomous vehicles. There's mobility as a service and ride-hailing. So there's micro mobility as well. So there's a lot that's happening in the sector that has been changing things and forcing us to be very innovative. I think the onset of this pandemic will also just drive further innovation. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of opportunities and there's going to be a lot of change. In terms of focus, what we've seen, the best place to look at is what's happened in China. Because obviously the pandemic started first there, the lockdown started first there, so it makes sense for us to have a look. And what the research is showing is that within 6 months of the pandemic starting, that they'd return to normal levels, so normal transactions before the pandemic started. So that's very much what we are forecasting in, is that we're going to be returning to a normal within 6 months of when that lockdown started. But constantly we're looking at different products, categories, etc., that we can be doing to be able to maximize earnings for the drivers and transactions on our platform.
Cool. So I mean, you have it sounds like there's quite a positive outlook there for the e-hailing industry in the short to medium term, which is really good. So thanks, Gareth. We appreciate that. And I think it actually will be interesting to see how the current situation ends up playing out, both in South Africa and across other African countries, as economies start slowly opening up, and what this new normal could actually mean, or what it could look like in the e-hailing space. But thank you, guys. So as we round up our panel discussion, I do have one more question that I'd actually like to put to each of you. So much of our discussion thus far has actually spoken to the state of e-hailing within Africa and more broadly. And it's clear that there remains a host of questions and complexities that still need to be solved if African markets and in particular workers are actually able to fully realize the benefits of this technology, as you alluded to, Gareth. So I'd like each of you to kind of put your regulator caps on for a second and give us your views around what you think the future regulation in the e-hailing sector will look like, and how do you think governance should evolve to improve the welfare of workers and support the growth of this early stage industry. And Julie, I think we'll start with you.
So I think that the first thing is that the regulation should be done cautiously. I don't see any markets in the world, including the most advanced markets, where this is being done really well with clear results telling us exactly what should be done. The Taxi Commission in New York City has 600 staff. So they have huge amounts of capacity to think through these things, to model, to take the big data and make sense of it. That doesn't exist in a lot of the places where we work. And regulation could make things worse. So when we looked at the proposals in Kenya for what they would do to drivers, for example, a cap on commissions could be disastrous. It could force certain platforms out of the market. It could lead to a flooding of supply that makes individual drivers' incomes plummet even further. And the introduction of hourly caps as well could force drivers to spend some of that 65 hours a week on lower income platforms, in fact, increasing their total time behind the wheel. So we have to be really thoughtful about how we approach regulation and think about where are their actual capacities to do the kinds of things that might be helpful. And I think a simple one that African regulators can think about is, as I mentioned, sort of regulating the duration of contracts between platforms and drivers and owners, so that everyone is clear about the terms for more reliable fixed periods that an investor can actually plan around.
Great, thanks, Julie. Raymond, we'll give you a chance next.
Okay.
Thanks, Raymond.
So with respect to the future of the industry in regards to regulation and worker welfare, we know from the survey that we're just completing that the average wage per month earned by the drivers on this platform, so under normal circumstances, is about above $350, which is almost a 400% increase over the current minimum wage in Nigeria at about $70. So when you consider the pandemic situation, for instance, the government has offered some palliatives, including food distribution and conditional cash transfers. But these were targeted to those on the country's poverty register, specified at below $2 a day. So in these instances, these platform workers are automatically excluded from these stimulus packages. Also, from the central bank, there was a stimulus package that was provided a targeted credit facility of about $125 million to support households and MSMEs that were affected by the pandemic. Again, these platform workers are not specified as beneficiaries. So when you look at it within this context, it begins to crystallize that the welfare for these workers begin to crystallize on the shoulders of the platform businesses themselves. We know that even though that these drivers work an average of over 60 hours per week, in contrast to the labor regulatory requirements in the country, the workers are still considered as independent contractors and not direct employees of the platform businesses, and are engaged on a part-time basis with no entitlements such as paid sick leave or housing or medical or gratuity, not to talk of pension. And from our surveys, we also understand that the income that most of these workers earn from the platforms constitute about 70% of their total monthly income. So more, of course, should be done by these platforms with respect to worker welfare, especially during these trying times, even though they are not regarded by these platforms as their direct employees. Then with respect to the sustainability of this sector in Nigeria going forward, information just came in some days back following the completion of some major BRT corridors in Lagos State. The Transport Commissioner announced that they'll be deploying more buses to completely replace the bikes and tricycles or what have you that have since been banned from flying some of these key routes across the state. So when you look at the business environment, it looks quite bleak for the e-hailing sector in Lagos, especially for these bike platforms. Coupled with the uncertain licensing regime, the picture looks quite green. So the short-term option may just be to strengthen their logistics business, but this will just be a small market segment in relation to the investments that have been already committed to these platforms. Even also, when you put it in the context that within this proposed market pivoting, some major players are already dominating this segment, the logistics segment in Nigeria. So when you put all this together in the long term, the jury is still out with regards to whether these platforms are ever going to be able to survive in this market, especially the bike hailing platforms. So that's just my take on that with respect to regulation or their survivability in the long term.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Raymond. And then Gareth, just to round up.
Thanks, Matthew. So I think just to build on what Julie was saying, I think it's really important to follow evidence-based regulation, where sometimes there is the best intention, but there hasn't been evidence that has been looked at in other markets to see whether this actually works and whether this is, or whether it actually causes more harm than good. So I think that's really important, and something that we propose fairly frequently is let's find evidence-based approach and just use an evidence-based approach to this. The next is providing some stability and predictability. As Raymond spoke to about the Okadas and the nature of Okadas in West Africa, there are a number of players who had really large investments there. And when a regulatory environment can change that drastically in such a short space of time, it causes companies to really rethink about whether it makes sense to invest in that market or not. So in terms of deciding whether to invest in a market initially, that's one of the questions that was posed is, one of the things is there an enabling environment? Is there a certain amount of predictability with regards to regulation? And then, yeah, is it evidence-based? Because otherwise things can get really difficult being able to create a sustainable business in that specific market.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Gareth. And thanks to the panelists for your valuable contribution there. So I think those are really, really key insights that we'll definitely look to incorporate in our own research and understanding of this industry, and hopefully we can actually see that being actioned in the near future. I'd just like to take a minute or two to share a couple of key takeaways for me from our discussion today. So the first, I think, is that while Africa's e-hailing industry has definitely shown strong growth over the last few years, certain points made by Raymond and Julie regarding the Nigerian and Kenyan markets do raise some concerns for me about the sustainability of this industry, given the current regulatory environment. And I think Julie and Gareth's points again around kind of evidence-based or proportional regulation is definitely one to keep in mind for regulators going forward, particularly given the fall in demand that's likely to be brought about by the COVID crisis. Secondly, is that the e-hailing industry definitely does appear to have a number of benefits for individuals. And from our studies, we've seen this particularly for youth in terms of access to formal markets and income earning opportunities. However, I don't think that we fully yet understand the total cost to operate in the sector. As Julie mentioned, from the high fixed costs and deductions to distorted contract arrangements, I think, therefore, it is definitely important that we get a grip on these, because if not, many workers are likely to continue to face significant strain to realize a sustainable livelihood on these platforms. And then finally, I think the response of e-hailing platforms will be key here in two ways. So firstly, in terms of the COVID crisis, I think that e-hailing platforms, their ability to pivot operations into new sectors or sources of demand will be really important in ensuring that continuity, both for the platform and for workers. And then there's this aspect of risk mitigation. So as Gareth said, kind of including regular and open dialogue between drivers and passengers and the platform to kind of ensure safety overall. But beyond this, I do think platforms have a role to play in actually finding ways to make more comprehensive social protections and financial services accessible to these informal drivers. So those are just some of the key insights that I took out from this discussion, and I hope for each of you here that there was a valuable little snippet that you'll be able to kind of take away from this webinar. Before we wrap up, I am aware of time. I did promise that we would try and take a couple of the audience's questions, and I'd like to do that. So I'm just going to look at the top rated one here. It says, and this is open to all panelists and to you, Peter, but it says that, dear panelists, it would be great to hear your thoughts or comments on this in a Pan-African growth sense. For most e-hailing platforms, their goal for growth and scale is much less about actually e-hailing taxis and more about becoming a huge platform for digital payments and digital commerce. See Gojek in Indonesia. We would really like to hear your thoughts on what you think the real bumps along the road and challenges will be to this in any respect. So whether that be regulations, digital access, connectivity, etc. So I'll leave that for our panelists, whoever perhaps feels most comfortable to answer that. That's a really interesting question.
So I'll answer perhaps the side in terms of growth. So if the business is going to grow, or if it's going to be successful in a specific market, if we're looking at entering into new markets, there are a couple of things that we need to have a look at from a certain baseline perspective. The first is, what is the smartphone penetration? Because you're not going to be able to access the app if you don't have a smartphone. The second is, how reliable is internet connectivity? Because if you can't get internet connectivity, you can't access the app. The next is then, how cheap is that data? Because if the data is prohibitively expensive, it's not going to make sense for this to be a cheaper alternative to some of the existing modes of transport. Then we're having a look into the prevalence of vehicles and how easy it is to be able to get access to vehicles in that specific market, how many vehicles are there, etc. And then it's having a look at the earnings per hour and what people are earning in that market currently and what the other alternatives are, and whether what the earnings could be on the platform would be attractive to drivers to be able to have a look at. So if we're having a look at whether it's going to be able to grow, those are some of the big things that we're having a look at from a commercial perspective, in addition to the regulatory that we spoke about in the past. Matt, I think you're still on mute, but.
Sorry, were you speaking, Raymond?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the very important points that Gareth has raised. Beyond, in terms of scaling, maybe pivoting to other critical business segments or the verticals across their business operations to grow their size and push further their market valuation and all that. Beyond the constraining and uncertain regulatory environment, one other key issue that impedes demand adoption and creation is the issue of trust. We know even within the e-hailing sector that the issue of trust is very, very critical in terms of how users are willing to even adopt or use those services. So when you consider some instances where there are kind of driver manipulations with respect to fare trips and all that, then these fraudulent activities is a major barrier to user adoption. And so in deference to regulatory environment, some of the key internal issues that these platforms will need to take care of is how they design a platform system that can ensure that those who are adopting these platforms have a high level of trust in the mechanisms that they are using to determine their price, they are using to check their fares and all that. So those are critical issues also that they need to also consider when you want them.
Great, thanks for that, Raymond. And then I think a final question here, this is for Julie. It says, what role should governments play in ensuring, sorry, it just moved here. Oh, here we go. What role should governments play in ensuring that ride-hailing drivers can earn a decent wage and have some safety net? Yeah, that's for Julie. I think you've touched on that, but please, yeah, Julie.
I guess two things. So we have to keep in mind that ride-hailing companies and drivers themselves are also subject to market forces. And there are trade-offs that we have to keep in mind about how many drivers can be accommodated and what their pay is going to be. That utilization rate has to factor in there. And so governments have to be very careful about how, I think, closely they get involved. And in these markets, huge levels of informality. Only 16% of Kenyan workers have a formal job. Minimums go out the window. Not all governments have the capacity to intervene in a way that's particularly helpful. So I think it's really about making sure that the markets function fairly has got to be number one, so that they don't get stuck in debt traps that they can't get out of when prices change.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that, Julie. So I think that brings us to the end of our webinar. I do know that there are a lot of other questions in the Q&A. And just after everyone closes out from the webinar, there will be a survey feedback form where you can actually add additional questions, and we'll do our best to actually respond to those directly to you. So this is really just to encourage and stimulate conversation going into the next part of the series of webinars. And we'd also like to get your feedback on new topics that we should be approaching. But before I go into that, if we can just move to the final slide of the document. We at Senfree and Eye2Eye, among our other partners, are really looking to do more rapid research like we've done here in this space, particularly around the resilience of platform business models and platform workers to withstand the ongoing crisis. And we're making a call here for you to please get in touch with us around these sets of initiatives. So if you're a funder in this space looking to fund ideas, we do have a couple of project proposals in mind. But also if you're a platform or any other industry player or member, do contact us so we can kind of get our heads around the key topics that we should be exploring further. In order to get in touch with us, you can reach us on digital platforms at senfree.org. And just to note that our full platform database is live, and you can access that at our Eye2Eye facility or by email. We've also just published a blog that's soon to be followed by a longer note on the experiences of workers on e-hailing platforms in Nigeria, which is kind of developed around a survey done in collaboration with Lagos Business School. So that can be found at senfree.org. And I'm going to leave it there and encourage you to please complete the post-webinar feedback. It really helps us to do better with these webinars and also explore, I think, burning issues that make sense for all of you. I'd like to send a big thank you to our panelists today. I think they've added a lot of value to this discussion, and I've learned a lot. All of our speakers, both internal and external, and also to give a big thank you to Sinead Johnson, who has played a big role as our engagement manager in actually taking this research forward and has been operating a lot of the digital infrastructure on the back end for us today. We're very glad to have had you all turn out today, and we wish you well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.